Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thank you so much for coming to talk about The Yellow Bird Sings. Um, so I was going to talk a few minutes about kind of what inspired me to write the novel and some of the research I did, and maybe a bit about some of the themes in the novel, and read a short passage, and then I'd be really excited to be in conversation with you guys and get questions, etc. So to tell you the kind of the inspiration for the novel, I have to back up a little bit in my career. I was a philosophy professor. Um, that was my first life, although there might have been a few before that one too. And I was actually just finishing my PhD when my first daughter was born, and she was born deaf. And that was really kind of a shock at the time because we hadn't expected that. You know, when you read all the pregnancy books and they tell you to eat kale and you worry about, everything that might be happening, but this wasn't on our radar. And the experience of it, I think, just I was kind of overwhelmed and needed to start processing it. And I took to creative writing for the first time in my life. So I'd been doing this academic writing, which was dry and really not all that pleasant, to tell you the honest truth. And then I just started journaling about my daughter, about what was happening, about the decisions we were trying to make, about the fraught political, kind of divide between hearing and deaf. And I just found the writing to be such a nourishing thing to be doing. And it kind of like led me into a new career, really. I ended up putting these sort of snippets together, and after a long, long time, creating a memoir called If a Tree Falls. That is a philosophical title, admittedly, but it was, about raising our deaf daughters in a hearing speaking world. It was about discovering in my ancestry these deaf great aunts who I didn't know anything about, who, as it turned out, when they put their babies to bed at night, they tied a string from their wrist to their babies so that when the babies cried or fussed, they would feel this tug and wake. And so it was this incredible model of hearing given to me from my deaf ancestors. And it was also about my own childhood experience feeling unheard in many ways. And in a way, like the whole journey about raising our deaf daughters kind of got turned on its head, because I came to understand that I was worried, it's true, about whether they would hear, but I think I was really worried about whether I would hear them because of not necessarily having such hearing models, but then finding this inspiration in my ancestry. So that's what that that's what that memoir was about. And I was at a book event for the memoir, and I was talking about how we chose to give our children cochlear implants and hearing aids and put them into a hearing speaking world, which is a complex decision. And I was talking about how we were encouraging their every vocalization. So even if they were like screeching in the library, we were actually quite happy. Everyone else looked at us, but we were really happy they were making sound. And this woman in the audience later came over to me, and she described her childhood experience having to stay completely silent in this shoemaker's attic with her mother during World War II. So kind of the opposite enterprise as what I was engaged in. And she needed to be completely silent. And I thought so much about her, and also about her mother having to get her to be silent and essentially to vanish. And I just couldn't stop thinking about it. And I ended up interviewing her at length. And then she led me to other hidden children. And that's kind of the seed for how The Yellow Bird Sings came about. I was thinking about this woman and being silent, and what her mother must have been feeling as she sort of had to tamp down and almost make her child vanish. So I interviewed her, and then I interviewed others, and everyone had their own just kind of unbelievable story, full of ingenuity and inspiration, very different things, but all just, there were certain commonalities. I mean, there were things about the children who had to be separated from their parents where there was this kind of ongoing hurt, even 75 years later, that was just so remarkable. There was this appreciation for beauty wherever they could find it, that I think was maybe a key to their survival. There were many things I learned from interviewing these hidden children. But then I set all of their stories to the side, because I wasn't gonna write any of their stories, thinking maybe they'd write their story someday, maybe a child in their family would write it. So I wrote my own story, and we can get to why I wrote the story I did with music and the yellow bird and all these other things. But when I had a draft of the story, I decided I needed to go to Poland because I was in my like living room in Western Massachusetts, imagining the convent, imagining the farmhouse, and I just decided I got to go there. So I found this guide who was really amazing and very curious man, and really really smart. And I sent him my manuscript in advance, and he took me to these areas of Poland. So my eldest daughter wanted to come, and she came along with me. We went to this area of farmland where I got to see the layouts of like the farmhouse and the barn, and then these like long swaths of land. And often when you think about a farm, you might think there's a lot of privacy, but actually they were really lined up in these tight rows going back toward water. So there was not a lot of privacy, and your neighbor really could see what was happening. And that was very important, you know, to know and to be able to build the story in that way, worrying about neighbors, worrying about their children and what they see is happening in your barn, etc. He took me to this convent where Jewish children were hidden. So I got to see like not just like the partition where a child like had hidden during raids, but, you know, walk in and get the waft of the mushroom soup and the way my feet felt on the stone and all the sensory experiences that helped me write the story. And I also went to this area of primeval forest where partisans had camped and got to see how dense the forest was. We went in December, much to my daughter's horror. I wanted to know what winter in Poland would be like because my character has to survive the winters outside in this woods, and I really needed to kind of know what that would be. And so it was frigid. I mean, it really. Now my kids are like, what about setting it in Greece? Or, you know, can't the next novel take place somewhere really good? Anyway, so. And then in addition to that, you know, so at nighttime, this guide would like translate Polish texts that I didn't have access to in English. And I ended up also consulting with all different people. Like I consulted with a tracker so that I could understand how my character might be able to figure out how to move through the woods without leaving a trace. I talked to like mushroom foragers, nuns and Holocaust historians, and most importantly, this masterclass violinist who, when I knew the child was going to be a prodigy, I needed to understand, you know, how she was going to be learning, how she was practicing, what pieces she would play and when. And so this really generous masterclass violinist helped me understand what pieces to put in, and a musicologist actually helped me to really understand the stories behind the music. So really, I guess, all I can say is it takes a village to write a novel. I don't know, at least for me. And I'm so grateful for all those things. But it was also really super interesting. And you end up in these different rabbit holes that you would never expect. And your Google history looks really bizarre. And but it was a great process. And that's a bit about the research. And of course, there was a lot of reading, a lot of reading. And then, I mean, there was just the story itself and how it came to pass. And, you know, one of the things I can say is, you know, I decided that music was going to be this connective tissue between the mother and her between the child and her family in various ways. That was a pretty personal decision because that's a role it plays. I lost my father last September. He had played violin every day of my life, and so I grew up hearing the violin played every day. And I saw the ways in which the music, like he played it to connect to his Jewish roots. I think he played to connect to his family. I studied to be an opera singer, and then he and I made music together. And as I alluded about my memoir, there were ways I grew up feeling really unheard, but for whatever reason, when I sang, everyone kind of stopped, and I feel like my mom really heard me. And I just saw the ways in which music can really connect people, and also like the transportive power of music. And it was a choice to give this to Shira, in addition to this yellow bird, which I can just say, you know, that I wanted her to have a comfort in the barn. But I also wanted her to have something that could sing aloud the music she, you know, kind of felt pulsing inside her all the time. So I chose this bird, and I wanted it to be somewhat ambiguous because I wanted, because from a child's perspective, their imaginary bird is very real. And so I wanted it to be that when you're reading, you're like, maybe this barn, there is a bird in the barn, and it really, maybe it's taken to her and it's cupping in her hands or whatever. But it was to be a comfort. It was to play the music for her. It was to enact a childhood she really couldn't enact, as she had to stay silent and still. And also it was something that gave her an additional connection to her mom, because her mom began telling stories about this brave little girl and her bird in an enchanted garden. And this way, the mom kind of took the child's imaginary friend and like looped it into their own stories, and it became something between them. So there was a lot of kind of connections that were able to be made. And also as a writer, having this bird was helpful, because when I was writing from either the child's point of view or the mother's point of view, especially when I was in the child's point of view, there were things the child may not be aware of. I was kind of, you're somewhat limited by whatever point of view you're writing in. And this bird kind of enabled me to kind of layer in some subtext when I could, and that was a very helpful device to have. So maybe that's all I'll say for now, but I'll read a passage and then maybe we can open it up. I think I'll just read the very first page. No spoilers there. Okay. The girl is forbidden from making a sound, so the yellow bird sings. He sings whatever the girl composes in her head, high-pitched trills of piccolo, low-throated growls of contrabassoon. The bird chirps all the musical parts save percussion, because the barn rabbits obligingly thump their back feet like bass drums, like snares. The lines for violin and cello are the most elaborately composed, rich and liquid smooth, except when fear turns the notes gruff and choppy. Music helps the flowers bloom. When the daisies grow abundant, the bird weaves a garland for the girl to wear on her head like a princess, though no one can see. She must hide from everyone in the village, soldiers, the farmhouse boys, the neighbors too. The lady with squinty eyes and blocky shoes just dragged a boy down the street and returned smug and straight-backed, cradling a sack of sugar like a baby. When giants tromp past, the bird holes up in a knot in the rafter, silent and still. Tending the garden must wait. The girl, music trapped inside, buries herself under hay. She imagines her mother whispering their nightly story, or whisper singing her favorite lullaby. She holds tight to her blanket and tries to fall asleep, sniffing in vain for the faded scent of home.
We just got a comment actually that someone could hear the music in their head as they were reading the book, and so your writing evokes all of the senses. And we'll start off with the hardest question. Have you thought about a screenplay?
Well, I have gotten this question before, which started me thinking about a screenplay. And all I can say is that if anyone ever wanted to make my film, I'd really like to get Shira Haas. What is her name? Shira Haas. I'd really like to get her to be the mom. So if any of you have any connections, that would be really awesome.
So in my other life here at JCC Chicago, I, with Eileen, run the JCC Chicago Jewish Film Festival. So I'm putting dibs on we premiere it here.
Thank you. Yeah, reach out, send the book to a director you like. Yeah.
So I didn't realize that you were a philosophy teacher prior to writing. So how do you go from writing, as you said, these dry philosophy dissertations and to writing what is basically a mainstream book about the Holocaust?
Yeah. Well, first, let me say you go happily. So No, I mean, I really love philosophy, and I actually continue to teach it. I teach it at a care center for women who are struggling to get back into education after being derailed for a variety of reasons. Some of them being, just getting on the wrong track. Some of them, a lot of poverty, various issues. So I teach philosophy now, but in a way where it's just tethered to life in a way that I'm much more comfortable with, and really very rewarding and grounding, because everyone does think about these big philosophical questions, we humans. And, but I don't know, I think that someone said, how does philosophy inform your work? And I think it does inform my work in various ways, but I actually think my background in music informs it even more. I think that the musical background I have has like affected the way I write as a writer, but like in a lyrical way. But I also think that having deaf children affects it in terms of sensory description, because I think that when you're training children to attend to their environment the way you do when you work with a deaf child, you start noticing everything. You notice things visually, but you also are listening very, very carefully to make sure they don't miss anything. So it's kind of interesting. I think that I developed, every writer has their strengths and weaknesses, and I feel that like the sensory description might come from the music I played and also being the parent of deaf children. And maybe the kind of conceptual things I worry about comes from being a philosopher. Plot is something I always had to really work on. Like it wasn't something, whenever I would make like a big plot move, I would read back and be like, that is so contrived, I sort of have to go back and rework it. So like I said, you work with the strengths you're bringing, and then you try to pull everything along. And I mean, with regard to the philosophy writing, I mean, I was working on the nature of the self in its in its alienation. So I was working on the ways in which you might like want something but not want to want it. So like there might be a part of you, like if you think about a drug addict, they want the drug but they don't want to want it, and they're in a conflict. There's a struggle, an inner struggle. And where is the kind of free self or autonomous self in that struggle? Is the real you the one who wants it, or the one who wants to want it, or are you both? And how does that work? And how can you be free if you have these kind of struggles inside? So it was about kind of the fractured self in a certain way, which we all, I think, experience. And I think maybe that, you never lose these sort of fundamental things you invest in, I guess. Like I've thought a lot about that, and kind of went on in various ways to talk about the ways in which we might be connected but are also lonely, the ways in which we may be hearing but are also deaf in certain ways, and so like these themes kind of keep coming up in various ways, I think.
Let's see. So you said part of what it says in your biography that we talked about a little bit before we started was that, your book, specifically If a Tree Falls, is about silence and sound and loneliness and connection, but that also comes up in the Yellow Bird. And so did you feel silenced because you're a woman in what may have particularly been a man's sort of world philosophy? Why were you potentially lonely, or felt that you were unheard of? You were unheard as you were growing up?
So you're asking me sort of from a personal place, did I have experiences like that? I mean, I was a philosophy major at a time when very few women were in philosophy. There are more women in philosophy now. But it was me and like a lot of boys and men around the table when I was a philosophy major. I went to Columbia, and it really was, it was like being a girl among Talmudic scholars or something. It was like, it was pretty male dominated. And at graduate school wasn't that different yet either. As I said, there's been a lot of pushing to get women more in kind of more, not just in the field, but have a place in the field in a certain way. In terms of like the hearing and not being heard thing in my family, it's a kind of long story, but my and there's literal and metaphorical hearing loss in my family, you know. And my mom has both. She grew up with some major hearing loss, mastoid ear infections, and other things that kept her from being able to hear well. But she also grew up in a very difficult home, and she had to sort of retreat, I think, in order to cope. And it was a very intermittent connection I could have with her, and it was the best she could really do. But it was very hard as a child, kind of wanting the connection and sometimes getting it, in fact. And then it was just gone. And it was just very hard. And it was the thing I was most scared of with my children, wanting to make sure I could have a steady connection, but not really knowing how to have it. So it was a lot of kind of self-work. And like I said, when I heard about these women who tied the string from their wrists to their babies, I mean, it was such an innovation. It was like this saying, I'm going to be connected whether or not we have these obstacles. You know, it's dark and I can't see and I can't hear, but I'm going to hear you. I'm going to do it. And it was really inspiring. And yeah. And then I should also just say that the writing life itself, I feel, has really shaped my adult life, because, you know, having found the ability to express myself in this creative way that isn't sort of bound by these tight logic rules and, you know, very kind of arid and constrained, I've been able to kind of, I don't know, like you can let some of your subconscious just kind of rule the day. And it's a very healing process. I mean, even if most of it ends up on the cutting room floor, the process itself of writing has been a really healing thing.
So then are there pieces of your personality in the characters that you wrote in the Yellow Bird?
There definitely are. I mean, I felt incredibly identified both with the mother and the daughter at different times, and maybe all the time. I mean, I also felt very identified with the hidden children I met and interviewed with regard to that longing, the longing for their parents, especially those who had been separated. And, you know, like I said, even 75 years later, there was this unsolvable, you know, insurmountable pain and longing. And I don't know, I think it was all, you know, at most, I'm sure that what it takes to sustain a project, as long as it takes to write a novel, it has to be tuning into your own psychological material. Otherwise, like, you wouldn't keep writing it. You know what I mean? I think that that's the way work continues, because you have a need to kind of either express it, or, you know, yes, definitely express it, but also maybe process it in some certain ways. And it's interesting because we'll get to this, or maybe we won't, you decide, but I mean, we can talk about the ending if you want to, but, you know, it's interesting about the ending because people read it in really different ways, and some people feel really like they love it, and other people are like, they are longing for more. And that's not accidental, you know, and it's also grounded in the knowledge that reunions were so incredibly complex, and to not do a dishonor to those who have struggled with how to reunite, because like in our story, we're working with a 5-year-old child, and we have this very dear mother-child relationship. And later, there's some 20 years go by, and there's so much, you know, vacancy and loss that's been in the middle. And to bring Oprah Winfrey in at that moment, you know, what didn't feel fair to the people who really experienced these things. And so, but I mean, just back to what you're saying, I mean, the fact is that it's a very muddied field. I mean, it's longing, it's resentment, it's hurt, it's love. I mean, it's all these things wrapped up, but is not simple. So I think I wanted, and I guess I should say with every character I wrote, I didn't want it to be simple. I didn't want the farmer to be simple. I wanted, you know, there were brutal things that were happening, and he also brought socks and potatoes and told her what leaves were safe to eat. That's how people are. I mean, you know, there are, you know, even the righteous, you know, who take you in might wish sometimes you were gone. They might treat one with a favoritism they don't treat another. They, you know, there's all kinds of things. And nuns who maybe mean may also be scared, and girls who are mean may also have felt really terrible rejection from their parents. I mean, so it's like a feeling that you're trying to round it out for people and not create flat realities, if there is such a thing.
Yeah. So why a Holocaust book? I mean, you heard the stories about these hidden children and the need for quiet when they also needed to be heard. I mean, there's lots and lots of Holocaust books out there, family memoirs, historical fiction.
Yeah.
What drew you to writing a book about the Holocaust?
Well, you're right, because some of the themes, they really could have been hidden in some other scenario. First of all, there are other hiding cases in our history, and it could have been set somewhere else. I mean, I think two things were working on me to kind of move it into this genre. I mean, besides the fact that I had met the people I began interviewing were hidden children of the Holocaust, I felt also that I decided to incorporate music into the novel. And there's just, I was just reading the other day that, like, I don't know. I mean, people who were dressmakers had pianos. Jews had the music in their house, no matter what their economic standing. It's sort of a fundamental thing, and that was some consideration. The fact that we go to every Holocaust memorial and see our names, our family names there, obviously it's my heritage, it's my family. It's not necessarily the most direct. It's not like, I'm not a, child of a survivor, but there's family all in my, extended network. And so it just seemed like the most personal pathway. And, like I said, whatever sustains your project all the way from beginning to end, which is usually a very long time, that seems to be like what should drive.
Do you still perform? Do you still sing opera?
I don't. I haven't sung in a really long time. I mean, I should say, when I had deaf children, it was very hard, and it stopped me in my tracks for a little while. The feeling that you're singing and your baby can't hear you, it's just really hard. And then I realized by the time my second daughter was born, and she also was deaf, she was profoundly deaf, but I knew enough by then to sling her over my shoulder and walk around and sing anyway, because she can feel everything. I'm pretty sure she heard as well as anyone, because, there's all these different ways of perceiving. But I didn't really, pursue it professionally anymore. And then, it can warm up in the shower or whatever, but you sing in the car, nothing very fancy. Yeah.
So does music play a role in your lives with your family?
It does. I mean, it's very casual. I mean, both my kids who are, wearing hearing technology, they love music. You never know what they hear with cochlear implants. It's like notorious that you don't really know what is heard in terms of music. Like, they're pretty good at understanding language simulation in cochlear implants, but they don't really understand. Oliver Sacks actually was working on this before he died, trying to understand that. But they love it. And so even before they had technology, they would be like, their feet gripped to the floor and their hands might hold a balloon while we had music playing, because you can feel the vibrations so well. And then later when they, put on the technology, they really loved it too. But I also say, my younger daughter had this thing where, when she was just done, she would just take her stuff off and fall right asleep, because she just, she could turn it all off too. So
sometimes I think we know quite a few people with cochlear implants, and sometimes I wonder if they actually have the better option, because you take them off and you don't have to hear anything that anyone else is saying. So they might have an advantage over us hearing people. What is the most important thing that you want readers to get out of this book?
Well, I mean, I think that something that really struck me when I was talking to the hidden children I interviewed was this feeling that recognizing beauty even in the tiniest things, like someone had described like the vanilla scent of a tree bark. That was the reason she could go on from where she was to the next thing. This tiny little recognition was a sustaining enough to keep going. And I think that's such a powerful thing. And especially when we have kind of dark forces, when things feel kind of dark in the world, when we're going through a global pandemic, whenever things are really hard, and that to understand that people survive these absolutely horrific things by just sort of looking outside maybe and seeing something like the way the leaf is moving in the wind and feeling some solace and being able to keep going and find strength in that. I just found that so amazing. And I felt like my novel was about both the unbreakable connection between this mother and child, but also about the role of creativity and beauty in survival. So, the way music plays a role, the way beauty plays a role. I just wanted that to be out there.
At some point, though, in the book, they both sort of gave up on ever finding each other. And that difficult to write?
Yeah, I mean, it was. And I also wanted to really convey how hard it was and how people really just did have to keep going without the connection. Like, now we have, Facebook and Google, and we can find anyone from our past and, friends from when they were 5 and whatever. And there, it's like you get off at a train station, there's a fence with a bunch of notes tagged onto it, right? It was so hard to find each other. And you come back to your home village and it's completely devastated. I mean, there was just so little tracking. And then I wanted to make this point about the change of names and the identity, the way in which you lose the thread of your identity in these situations. So, there was Irina Sendler who would write, a person's Jewish name and their adopted Catholic name or whatever on a piece of paper and bury it in a garden. And there were a few people who found their families that way and figured out who they had been and who they, who to look for, etc. But for many, many people, the thread was just lost, especially little children who couldn't remember their parents didn't have names like, whatever. They were mama and papa or whatever, and their own name got changed, and it was all very elusive. They were trying so hard to fit into their new setting, and they were sort of letting go of the past. So, I mean, I was really struck. I went to the Holocaust Museum in DC and saw this set of pamphlets with people's pictures. They were young children at the time, and it said, "Do you remember me?" And it was this literal question, like, do you? Because if you told me who I was, like, I'd be able to find I'd have my name, I'd be able to find my family, I could find, just this literal question was so striking to me. And the idea that you could lose the thread, not that, without that much difficulty, really. With all the false identity papers. She was really young.
She was really young and almost brainwashed. I mean, really brainwashed.
For your survival, forget who you were,
Right. I find the way that you wrote the scenes about hiding under the hay and not moving for extended periods of time and the hunger, like I felt it. And I'm thinking about, look, I've been on this call with you for 33 minutes. I've probably moved 10,000 times. I can't talk without, using my hands. I have an itch. I have to scratch it. How did that come into your mind? Because we are beings who move. So how did you, I mean, you wrote it so that you could feel the pain and the discomfort.
Yeah. I mean, it was like the practice of discipline it takes to be that child, or that mother, like trying to understand the amount of effort it would take to stop everything and to endure it over all this time. I mean, and there are people who left their hiding spots and they could barely walk anymore, and there were situations where the tiniest little flinch could have given you away. And so it was really important to me. I mean, it's interesting because some people were like, wow, it was just kept going. And I'm like, yes, it did. Um, like I'm not, I think it's funny because my editor at Macmillan, I think what she found really important about the novel was to share something that you don't often see, which is like, how are you going to pee and poop in a barn and brush your teeth and stay completely silent when I have a kid home for a snow day and I can barely occupy them, for the few hours, and they can be loud and they can go romp in the snow and come back and have hot chocolate and I can barely deal with it. And so it was like, to extend that till the point where it's pretty painful even to read. Never mind what it must have been like to be that person.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's interesting. We, like I said, we're moving beings, and I have older daughters, and just throughout these last few months, all of us being home together in this space, and nobody can sit still and nobody can be patient, and when is the next thing coming? So it was really hard for the daughter, but I can't imagine the pressure on the mother. I understand the wanting to save her child, but the pressure and the stories and how to keep her mind going, and then trying to teach her in the midst of, think about all these parents that have been home for all these months trying to do homeschooling in the best of conditions.
I know. And part of that was really inspired by this hidden child who I met he was hidden in the attic of a school building, and he had to look out in these slats and see children who were actually playing in the yard and, running and chasing each other. His mother had access to an atlas, and she would say things like, he would study it and she'd say, if you had to get from Odessa to Warsaw, what route would you take? And, tell me how you would go and where would you go? Really unbelievable innovation and, passing the time, but teaching at the same time. He learned also how to read in his attic little space too. He also, by the way, won the Nobel Prize in chemistry. Since, later, he's an incredible man. And, I know. I mean, the kind of how to not waste the incredible resource of our children, to help them continue to develop even in these brutal times. And I think that's what, a lot of parents were trying to do, to be able to not have it be just, staring into the hay, which it, is for quite a long time too.
Yeah. Yeah, I it's remarkable. It seems so much easier to give up than to actually push on and move on. And I never forget, our younger daughter used to come home from a day at school and say, let's get the homework done. And she'd lay down on the floor screaming and yelling because she was over it. She didn't want to do it. But to sit in the loft of this barn day after day after day and just be able to find some normalcy, if you could even call it normalcy.
Yeah. I also wanted it to be clear that there were moments where maybe the mom was like, like, if I have to do this one more time, or, maybe it would be better if, like I just, to share every bit of food, to always be doing that is such a, it's like it's also a natural thought that I want to just eat this potato, and I don't want to say
but how painful. And a 5-year-old 6-year-old only thinks about their immediate self, but how painful for the mom to see the daughter go out into the farm and get those eggs and be fed by the farmer's wife and not get any of that sustenance for herself. I mean, you could start to understand where maybe the decision to send her off to, be with the nuns came from a different kind of hunger.
Yeah. I mean, I also wanted to express how every choice was so unclear. Like she was then doubting, she got to the family camp and people had their children with them. And she was like, maybe I should have brought her. How could I have given her up? But then I wanted to show, and there was a child that dies in that scenario too, because there was no answer, that was a safe answer. And so I wanted it to, and I do also feel that from when I interviewed, so I felt this like rejection from the children whose parents left them, even though they knew they were given away in order to live. There was this feeling of rejection, which, doesn't sound logical as your life is being saved, but it's just this primitive feeling if your parent gives you, But I think that there was the flip side of parents feeling ashamed or guilty, even though, again, they were doing this for their kid to live, but questioning everything, like what, feeling it. So I wanted you to see that Rosha might feel a bit of shame, like when she gets to the camp and there are other kids and she should have done it a different way, or she could have held on to her kid, to not be, no one's free of those things either, this sort of tortured psychology in a situation where there was no winning.
Right. The guilt of it all on both sides, on all sides. I mean, I'm sure, the nun felt guilty about, changing her hair color and, making sure that she encouraged her to forget about who her mother was. I mean, she certainly didn't remember who her father was. She was so young. Yeah. I found it poignant when the first Shabbat that they were actually in that barn, and the mom says, I can't believe I haven't lit the candles. We haven't. Yeah. How much of, because that was really it talked about that, and then not so much about, their lives being religious Jews, which is what I inferred, but how does Judaism play a role in your life and your family's life?
Let me just say one thing with regard to the novel, that I didn't really picture them as particularly religious. I saw them as, some basic observances. But I thought that was important too, because it didn't matter how religious you were. If you were Jewish, you were hunted, And so it was, some people have wondered about, why weren't they more religious? But I feel kind of like there was this leveling thing, and it had nothing to do with really, either how observant you were or how religious or whatever. And I just thought that seemed important. I don't know. My own Jewish life is interesting. My father was. I grew up in a kosher home, and my father was particularly observant. My mom less so, but accommodating, and I don't know. I mean, as we've gone through, our children went to a day school, and I think we're intermittently observant. That's all I can say. We're not so so it's not very habitual.
I think that's American Jewry for the most part, is that, we take the pieces of what feels best for us and makes it comfortable. I mean, you didn't really go into depth about, what their practices were once they were free. I don't know that they were ever actually free. I'm sure that they're, the guilt and the loneliness, but
it's true. Well, also a lot of people's faith in God was very shaken, and it was, I think it was very hard to find your bearings. And I think it was hard also to have the comfort of the church, in terms of ritual and the beautiful music there as well. Maybe a different kind of beauty, less chaotic, more orderly. I was trying, I think that, but both having some meaning for a child whose identity is shifting, having to shift at all this time. And I'm actually really interested in this. It's something that I'm working on in my next project, having to do with all this how one's identity is shaped by these shifts that have to happen. So
What the blanket that she hid her daughter's name in, I wasn't sure the significance of, you know, the nun digging it up and giving it back to her, like just to let her know. It didn't necessarily mean that she survived, the daughter, because the blanket was. So what kind of was the
yeah,
significance of that?
yeah. I mean, well, I want to first of all say, you know, she sewed the name into the seam of the blanket, which was a very risky thing and haunted her too, because was she giving her, you know, it could be the thing that, you know, sentenced her daughter. It was also possibly this hopeful key to getting back together, you know, reuniting afterward. So it was very like very loaded thing. Plus, it was like a major comfort source. I feel like, I don't know, the fact that the girl buried her blanket because it was becoming almost unsafe. And maybe it was burying a part of her, you know, she was trying to kind of tamp down a thing that was going to get her hurt. And I don't know. I mean, I think that the nun was trying to give her back a piece of her child. I mean, I think that the nun was basically like, this is a thing you had with your daughter, and I want you to have it. It wasn't really a symbol like maybe she's still alive. I think it really was just this little bit of her child. It was confirmation, you know, and maybe it was a way of saying she always still thought of you. Like she carried, you know, she did have this little piece and she had it with her until, you know, it wasn't safe enough and we put it in the ground. But like this is part, you know, it was like a rejoining of some sort of, and it was, you know, maybe small consolation at that point because the girl had been moved, like, you know, they kept missing each other. And
that was pretty common for that time that
yeah.
people, because we're a small group, I'm happy to let people unmute themselves and ask some questions. If anybody is interested in asking any questions, we can do that at this time. Otherwise, I have one or two more questions that I have. Doesn't look like anybody is.
I just have one question. What did you say your memoir is called?
It's called If a Tree Falls.
Okay.
And then there's a little subtitle, A Family's Quest to Hear and Be Heard.
I'm gonna put it in the chat box so you have the link to it.
On the topic of observance, if anyone knows of a gluten-free, dairy-free, egg-free challah recipe, that's one of the biggest obstacles. One of my daughters is not able to have a lot of different food. And anyway, if someone can email me if they know. I figure I've got a live audience here. I might as well ask.
There's I know on Facebook that there's a group, Jewish and Gluten Free. So you might want to check that out.
Yeah.
And so I always like to ask this one fun question because most of the discussions we have are about the Holocaust, but what is your favorite book, both as a child and as an adult?
Well, I love the book Half Magic. Have you read that? Okay, that's a child's book, but it's unbelievable. So that's my favorite. And my favorite adult book, I mean, that's such a hard question. I'll tell you that I was just very inspired while working on The Yellowbird Sings by Anthony Doerr's work in general, and also specifically All the Light We Cannot See. And the reason I was so just taken with it is that it's just sentence by sentence beautiful, and that was like inspiring to me. And you know, the way I write, which is, you know, kind of a very slow way. I mean, there were times when I was just editing the manuscript for verbs. like, is this the strongest verb? Should I change, whatever, maybe you work through like what, and then then you might read it all the way through for something else, just like, how is the setting now? Does this setting feel you're really there? Does this setting feel you're really there? And I just felt very inspired by his work, because I just felt he has such a grasp on language, and he makes words new again. And I love him. There are many, many amazing books, but that it was a book that kind of was like a inspiring book while I was working on this.
That was that was also a very good book.
Yes. It was
what are you working on now? What's your next project? What are you working on another book?
I'm working on a new novel. I'm very excited about it. It took a while to get traction. Like, I was slipping around with all these ideas that were not taking, and now I finally have something that's taking. And it's interesting, because there's a real relationship between this, between The Yellowbird Sings and the new novel. I decided to go post World War II and develop the stories of a brother and sister pair who were hidden in a Polish home, and then there's these, I don't know if you know of these movements that went in and tried to take Jewish children that were in Christian settings and get them back into Jewish settings. And so this is a very complicated situation from sense of identity, from attachments. You're ruptured first from your first family, you get into a new situation, and if it's good, and then you're taken out again. And often those children were put into children's homes, they were put into orphanages, they were in DP camps, and eventually maybe they got to a kibbutz or something. But that's
what happened to the character in your book. I mean, the rabbi and his wife came and took her to eventually Israel.
Yeah, and like that situation from a convent where she loved and had attachments. But I've been thinking a lot about this thing called Koordinatia, which is this organization that was for the redemption of children after the war. And there's a lot of interesting language. Some people call it rescuing the children, and then other people say, hey, wait a minute, I think those families rescued the children, right? Let's be careful. But what I'm excited about, besides just wanting to investigate, because there were various ways they took the children. It was really something I think people don't know a lot about, how it worked. But I also am excited because there's a boy and a girl. The boy doesn't adjust as well because he's younger, and his Polish family is really his core family, whereas the girl really remembers some of her Jewish roots and kind of takes to the new situation. But the boy is on a kibbutz along with his sister, and he meets this violin prodigy. And so we're going to loop back into the middle of Shira's story. And some of that part where, the part you don't see, where she's trained and then she ends up at this concert in New York, and she'll have this husband who's, it's going to be probably from his point of view. But anyway, it's going to loop back to this story and sort of fill in some things. And I'm very excited about it because, just to be honest, I mean, I just heard there are people with how I ended that just really wanted more. And I feel like, honestly, I think it says what it needs to. The girl is looking, as she always does at a concert hall. There's a bird on her shoulder. There's a woman over there. The woman stands up as soon as she hears a thing. To me, it's pretty obvious, what's happening in this thing. And then it says, as it ends, with the yellow bird winging its way home. I mean, it's right there for the optimistic reader. Maybe for the for the pessimistic reader, they need to really see, moment by moment. But anyway, I thought because of that feeling, which is really interesting because it's that feeling of longing that the reader is left with, which is the longing that I think I have as a human being, and it's the longing I felt when I interviewed the hidden children, and I kept the longing was the acute feeling, that it even it ends on, because you just really do want to maybe see the embrace, but I wanted to also be honoring the complexity of it. And now I get a chance with a lot of space, because it would have felt like a separate book to me. Like, you were really in a relationship with, a dear relationship with a young child, and then to bounce 20 years, you needed to develop some things, you really needed to develop more in order not to tack on some separate book. So that's now what, in a way, I get to do that with from some other points of view, but and with a lot of other historical things that get to be highlighted that I think are really interesting. Oops.
So you'll come back and talk to us when that book is done, right?
Hang on, my headphones just came flying out. What did you say?
So you'll come back and talk to us when that book is, and when do we expect this book? Is it in the beginning?
It's at the beginning stage, so it'll probably be quite a while. But
how long did it take you to write The Yellow Bird Sings?
Well, it's so hard to answer that question because I met that hidden children, that first hidden child when I was doing this book event for If a Tree Falls, which was in 2010. And then it batted around and I was interviewing and I traveled and I was teaching philosophy and, whatever. So like by the time this book was published, it's been 10 years, but it wasn't 10 years, but it was in my life batting around in that way. So I don't know. I hope this one will be closer to 5. We'll see.
Well, we can wait for that. We can wait for that. I'll still be reading, I'm sure, God willing.
Right.
Jennifer, thank you so much for your time. The book was fascinating. If you have not read it, please check out Amazon, get the book, go to your library. It really, really was a fascinating book. And now I'm excited about, finding out the middle part because I was left a little wanting. So I'm glad I wasn't the only person. I can go to the glass half empty realm. So I do. When you kind of fall in love with a character or characters, as the case may be, you want the best for them. You want to know that they've had wonderful lives. So I'm glad that you're taking the opportunity to kind of grow the middle part. That's really exciting. So again, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks. It was my pleasure.
Please check out jccchicago.org. We have lots more author discussions this month. Next week we have a baking, little cookie decorating with one of our former colleagues who opened her own cookie business. So we're looking forward to having everyone join us again soon. Again, Jennifer, take care, be well. Everyone, thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much.
Take care.
Bye.